Welcome back to Pop Goes the 60s. I'm Matt Williamson, and this is part 2 of my Stuart Sutcliffe series. And in part 1, we looked at some of his artwork and talked about his artistic career. And in this one, we're going to talk a little bit about the image left in the wake of certain things that have been said that, as I said in the thumbnail, his art exploited and Lennon's legacy blackened. And I'm going to go into that momentarily here. And some of these stories you'll be familiar with. We're going to do a little busting some people's chops here, namely Pauline Sutcliffe, the younger sister of Stuart. Now, back in 1994, when the movie Backbeat came out, that was actually a book, and Pauline Sutcliffe, his sister, Stuart's sister, wrote that with Alan Clayson. And that was actually rather popular. That made almost $5 million worldwide, and that was a limited release film. And I remember seeing that film, and I couldn't find what the cost to make the film was. I'm guessing it was maybe a $1 million, but it made $5 million. That much I know. So it was actually, I think, quite successful. And it really put the story of Stuart Sutcliffe on the map. And I think it was crucial. You know, Stuart had always been talked about in biographies. And generally, not a lot was known about him because he had some contributions to the Beatles' look, but nothing musically, really. So that's where the story ended. But that picked up again after the movie Backbeat, and I'm going to go into that right now. The second book that was written on Stuart by his sister was Stuart, the Life and Art of Stuart Sutcliffe. And the third book, which was 2002, The Beatles' Shadow, Stuart Sutcliffe and His Lonely Hearts Club. Boy, they had to kind of go far to squeeze in a Beatles song title with that one, huh? The Beatles' Shadow, Stuart Sutcliffe and His Lonely Hearts Club. Horrible title. But in this book is where it all started. She accused John Lennon of brutally attacking Stuart in a jealous rage, which led to his death. Pauline has also asserted she believed her brother and Lennon were actually lovers. All right, now this actually wasn't the first time this came out. We may, if you've read the book, The Lives of John Lennon by Albert Goldman, that story was started here. I'm going to break this down a little bit because this is what happens when, I guess, you play games of telephone. The idea that John Lennon had beaten Stuart Sutcliffe and that had hastened his death came from an interview Goldman did with Marnie Hare. Now, Marnie Hare was an assistant to John and Yoko from the late 70s to about 1983. And Yoko Ono, in fact, had recommended that Goldman speak to her. So that story came from Yoko. It was told from John to Yoko to Marnie, and then Marnie Hare is telling it to Albert Goldman. So by the time Pauline uses it, that's like the fifth person in line, fifth hand, if you will. Now, Marnie Hare, who's Marnie Hare? Is she credible? Well, she worked for Ono for quite a long time, for a few years after John died. Marnie Hare's daughter was actually interviewed by a colleague of mine, Anthony Rotuno, on Glass Onion on John Lennon. And this gets talked about. And Marnie says, well, you know, my mother wouldn't lie about something like that, although she admitted it could have been embellished. Her mother was known for doing a little bit of that. So we have the instance of John Lennon supposedly telling this to Yoko. But why this wouldn't have ever come out before, there's no witnesses to this. And then Yoko, for some strange reason, telling this strange story that makes John look very bad to Marnie, who then tells it to Goldman. So you get the idea of where that comes from. It's not a John Lennon quote. It's hearsay through three people. Okay, this is the quote from Albert Goldman's book. He told Yoko Ono, who repeated the story to Marnie Hare, that he had gotten into a quarrel with Stu at Hamburg. They were standing in the street, and suddenly John was seized by one of his fits of uncontrollable rage. He lashed out with hands and feet. In recounting the incident, he laid special emphasis on the fact that he was wearing cowboy boots with hard, pointy toes. When he came to his senses, he looked down and saw Stu lying on the pavement. He was groaning and blood was coming down the side of his face. Let me read to you the quote that Pauline had in her book, The Beatles' Shadow, Stuart Sutcliffe and His Lonely Hearts Club. This is what she said, quote, I believe that the cerebral hemorrhage that cost Stuart his life was caused by an injury inflicted by John in a jealous rage. John had viciously kicked my brother in the head in a sustained, unprovoked attack, unquote. So, okay, that's her quote. That's what she claims. So the story of there being some kind of a fight or anybody getting beaten happened in early 1961 at Latham Hall when the Beatles were jumped by a gang of toughs, apparently. Now, according to booking agent Alan Williams, who was essentially their first manager, he says Lennon and Best went to Sutcliffe's aid, fighting off his attackers before dragging him to safety. Sutcliffe sustained a fractured skull in the fight and Lennon's little finger was broken. Now, after this fight, it's been said that Sutcliffe had refused medical attention. So they were going to take him to the hospital after they took him home, but he refused to go. Now, I don't know if he's trying to be a tough guy or what, but we do know for sure that he failed to keep an x-ray appointment at Sefton General Hospital, and we have documentation on that. So either way, not going to the doctor, missing the x-ray appointment, not a good thing, but that's what we know. Now, fast forward, she wrote the book in 2002 with his inflammatory remarks. So a year later, she's planning to put all her brother's stuff up for auction. So all of Stuart's, his drawing books, birth certificates, poetry, everything but the kitchen sink, it's all being put up for auction. And this is happening in 2003. So this book with all the inflammatory remarks comes out. And of course, when we're getting closer and closer to the auction, which is held at Bonham's, she's doing press. And there's a good month long of press leading up to the auction. Now, the auction was valued at about £1 million. Now, one of the things she said before the auction was, "This sale confirms for me that I haven't spent 40 of my years of life in vain." Okay, so listen to some of this press. So the press leading up to the auction was held July 29th, 2003. So here's some press from July 13th, a few weeks ahead, from The Independent. Now the headline reads, "Fifth Beatle died after fight with Lennon, sister claims." That's the headline. The article says, "The brain hemorrhage that led to Stuart Sutcliffe's death was caused by his closest friend," claims the sister of the former bass player. "And the proof is in the archive she's about to auction," writes James Morrison. Well, let's see this proof. Here's the proof. So there's this little black book that Stuart had, and in it, it contains a series of barely legible scrawls and pained exclamations, apparently reflecting Stuart's gradual mental collapse. The pages of the book are peppered with cries for help. Words and phrases such as torment, shout, explode, and the bloody brain appear in shaky handwriting, often surrounded by exclamation marks and accompanied by unsettling abstract designs. This is her proof. Laughable, I realize, but there's more. Asked if she believed the punch-up with Lennon was the most significant contributing factor to her brother's death, she replied, quote, "Yes." She also restated that her belief that Sutcliffe and Lennon, who became close friends while studying together at Liverpool College of Art, had a homosexual affair. John, this is her quote, "John said himself at one point that this happened," unquote. I have not been able to find that quote. So that is, I wish you would forward that or cite who said it. Now, 5 days before the auction at Bonham's, there's another article, and this is by BBC News. The headline is, "Sutcliffe's sister denies Lennon claim." So here's what she says in the article, quote, "I did not say what was quoted in the papers, and I'm shocked by it. I'm distressed for John Lennon's family and for my own family and for the millions of Beatles fans worldwide who would be deeply offended by it," she said. Now let me read you the quote from her book again. This is priceless. "I believe that the cerebral hemorrhage that cost Stuart his life was caused by an injury inflicted by John Lennon in a jealous rage. John had viciously kicked my brother in the head in a sustained, unprovoked attack." So now she's completely denying it. This is in the same press. This is 2 weeks after she said, he did it. So further in the article, she said the fight between Lennon and her brother could not have been helpful. Weeks before the bass guitarist died of a brain hemorrhage in 1962. So he died April 10th, 1962. So this quote is suggesting that John had seen him a couple weeks before he died. Not sure how that could have happened because Stuart was struggling in Hamburg while John and the Beatles are playing in Liverpool. When they went back to Hamburg, that's when they discovered Stuart had just died that day. So there's some conflicting, I don't know how she gets around that. So the auction at Bonhams happens July 29th, 2003, and much is sold. I don't know the dollar figure, but apparently Pauline was the only heir. So she got her millions, whatever she got, that went to her. So fast forward 2 more years, 2005. The BBC does a documentary on Stuart. It's called The Lost Beatle. So the Stuart Sutcliffe story is kind of a recurring story. Backbeat in 1994, and here we got a new documentary this time about 10 years later, 11 years later. And here's what Pauline says in it.
In my last book with Douglas Thompson, we actually quote other people, including John himself, who gives a graphic account of that event. And yet, there are as many people who believe or want to believe that it didn't happen.
By 2005, in this BBC documentary, Pauline is clearly stating that others have quoted this as if it's been reported by people that were there, and she's leading people to believe something that is certainly not true. Now, I mentioned the Goldman book, and I'm going to give you an example of how both Goldman and Pauline deceive. Now, I'm not here to tell you that this is an all bad book. In fact, this book has got quite a lot of value. And those that have been through his archives and his research for this book have said that his research is excellent. It's just that he uses it in ways that are deceptive. And I'm going to give you an example of that right here. So I already read you part of the story here that John supposedly told Yoko, who supposedly told Marnie Hare, who reported to Goldman. Okay, horrified by what he had done, he had taken off running. Paul, who was present with another man, perhaps George, hollered, "Come back, you bloody bastard. You're a damned fool." Doesn't sound like Paul, does it? John never stopped running. The death of Stuart Sutcliffe haunted Lennon for the rest of his life. When he felt his own end was nigh, he told Fred Seaman how completely responsible he felt for Stu's death. So here we have Goldman bringing in a quote from Fred Seaman saying that John felt responsible and that John told Seaman that. But by putting it after this whole thing, this whole paragraph describing that John had been the one who kicked Stuart or beat him or whatever, it gives the impression that Seaman is corroborating that story. He is not. Here's what Seaman says. This is Seaman's book, Last Days of John Lennon. Here's the sum total of what Seaman says about that incident. On the eve of the Beatles' third trip to Hamburg in early April 1962, 22-year-old Stu died of a brain tumor. When John heard the news, he became hysterical. He assumed that the deadly brain tumor was a direct result of a head injury Stu had sustained during the fight after a Beatles concert 2 years earlier, and he blamed himself for his friend's death. So here you have something that John is feeling guilty over Stu's death, but not because of any physical infliction he gave to Stuart. Now, to be a little more clear, we have Cynthia Lennon's account. He had a difficult time talking about Sutcliffe's death. When she did discuss it with her, she said he had an overwhelming sense of grief about it. Quote, "Later he talked to me sometimes about Stuart and about the awful sense of loss and guilt he felt. He agonized over why he had lived and Stuart had died and whether there was anything he could have done." So here we have a man that's talking to his wife about feeling guilty about maybe doing something more to help him in that fight, or just feeling guilty because he's alive and Stuart's dead. That seems to be what most people say about this whole incident. And that's the guilt that has been reported by firsthand quotes. In this case, by Seaman and Cynthia. Had no discussion of anything of John beating on Stuart at all. Now, one thing I've always been aware of is that if anything like this happened, Astrid, Stuart's fiancée, would have known about it. If there was some kind of bloody mess or something that was after the Latham Hall thing, she was with him all the time. She would have known it. And she's never said anything negative about Lennon in this regard at all.
John never, ever raised his hand towards Stuart. That is absolutely rubbish.
The idea that they would have still remained homosexual lovers after this vicious beating. Just doesn't seem to make much sense to me. So, I mean, you have quite opposite ends of the spectrum here of, the homosexual lovers and John beating the tar out of him, hastening his death. I'm sorry, this is just, I'm surprised that Pauline could say this with a straight face. When somebody dies, typically there's a post-mortem, and Pauline's version of it goes like this. A post-mortem revealed Stuart had a dent in his skull as though from a blow or a kick. Now there's a couple red flags there. Usually post-mortems don't say if there's a dent in his skull, they'll just report the dent. They won't say what it's from. They're speculative. That would not be in a post-mortem. So to go to the actual post-mortem, I found it in reference to it in Mark Lewison's book, Volume 1 of the Beatles All These Years. Quote, a post-mortem gave the cause of death as a blood clot on the brain. A forensic pathologist who asked to keep the brain for a further evaluation added that Stuart had suffered a hemorrhage. Astrid was also told that he had a rare condition where the size of his brain was gradually increasing and pressing against his skull. Now that's something I hadn't heard, but that's in the post-mortem. So that could be something, he could have died of something completely unrelated to this fight. Who knows? It's not known. So as we get on, after all this came out, you have the original writer, Alan Clayson, who wrote Backbeat with Pauline. So he weighed in on this, and he said he dismissed her claim, saying that it was a direct contradiction of the conclusions she came to with him. Quote, we concluded that Stuart wasn't beaten up by John Lennon. His condition was brought on by an overuse of amphetamines. He said, Mr. Clayson believes Sutcliffe was only ever involved in one significant fight at Latham Hall, Seaforth, Liverpool in early 1961. On this occasion, he said, the only involvement Lennon had was to wade in and help. Now, we do have corroboration on that in Pete Best's book. Here's what Pete says. Latham Hall was a two-tier dance hall in a tough area, and the Teds had been able to trap Stu backstage. John and I doubled back and, in usual style, put our heads down and charged into the fray, freeing Stu and collecting our fair share of knocks along the way. Lennon broke a finger, belting a Ted, and had to play guitar for a while wearing a splint. So that's Pete's account of the situation. This is actually a pretty good book if you can get your hands on it, the Pete Best story. This is a good read. By 2005, Pauline is still doing press, or she's still getting asked to do interviews. And this particular one was with Gary James, classicbands.com. And I'll put this one below. Because Gary James, by this time, you have this rumor out of this issues with John Lennon beating the tar out of Stuart, essentially killing him, according to Pauline. So James asks her about this. And this is her flippant answer. You're going to love this. Oh, honey, I don't have a lot to say about this beyond what I've said in my book. Now, I was not the original source of that, okay? John was the original source, according to other well-known writers or publicists or inner circle entourage. So I'm not the originator of that. I have not confirmed that in any way. John is the person who originated that story, so I really just comment on it. Yeah, she maybe didn't originate it in any way. She just perpetuates it in every way. So that I thought was precious. And then she goes on to say they were not homosexually inclined in any way. They loved women too much. It doesn't matter to me. I could care less, but I'm not the source on that. So you see how she continues to weave back and forth, and it's really quite amazing that somebody is this dishonest. Now, what really put the nail in the coffin for Pauline was Philip Norman. Now, Philip Norman, as you know, wrote the very famous biography Shout, 1981. And Pauline and Millie Sutcliffe, Stu's mother, were used pretty heavily. He used a lot of their quotes and things to help build that early story. But he was doing a new book. By 2009, Philip Norman did a book called John Lennon, The Life. And he had to address this rumor because this had come up again and hadn't when he originally interviewed her. This is what he says. In recent years, Norman had been frozen out by the Sutcliffe family for digging into the truth about the alleged Lennon attack. Quote, this is Norman's quote, I had a lot of cooperation from Sutcliffe's mother and sister, Pauline. We were friends for a long, long time, and it seemed to be quite late in the day that Pauline advanced the story that John attacked Stuart. Stuart was nearly out of the Beatles by that time. She said that the only witness was Paul McCartney, and that was something else I had asked him when I did the John book. You wouldn't forget seeing John launch a murderous attack on Stuart Sutcliffe. And Paul said he had no memories remotely of anything like that incident. And I did have to write that in the John Lennon book, and Pauline took that very amiss. So Norman went on to describe the need to get to the bottom of the story in his book. Quite a big accusation there. So Norman's trying to dig into it and ask McCartney about it. He says, no, I don't know anything of that at all. So here Norman goes to say, he said, she was furious and would not cooperate and would not continue to talk to me about John's relationship with Stuart. It would not give me any permission to use anything of Stuart's in the book. In all conscience, I couldn't ignore what McCartney had said about it, because he was instanced as the only supposed witness of that incident. She said Stuart had told their mother and told Pauline about it. So Pauline is also on record saying that Stuart had told her about it. Yet she passes the buck and says that John Lennon originated the quote. So Mark Lewison, who had interviewed her on several occasions, in 2001, he had said, we have Pauline saying that, well, Stuart had told me this personally. But here's what Lewison said. 11 years earlier than 2001, this is on April 5th, 1990, Kevin Howlett and I asked for her reaction to biographer Albert Goldman's suggestion in The Lives of John Lennon that John had beaten up Stuart and this had caused his death. Here's what Pauline's reply was. She replied, quote, I find it almost barbaric that anyone can accuse another person of having caused someone else's death. We have no knowledge at all that there was any physical assault between John and Stuart, none at all. And it's certainly not lodged in any of our consciousnesses that there was any such event or that John is culpable in any way at all. I find it actually quite monstrous as an idea. It's so unlikely, even just the logistics of it. They hadn't seen one another for a couple of months before Stuart died. No, I just find it absurd, the whole idea. So that's what Pauline was saying in 1990, which is about 12 years before her book and 13 years before she sold off all of Stuart's stuff. So there you have it, folks. Adding to the embarrassment, the Stuart Sutcliffe estate released a recording claiming to be Stuart singing Love Me Tender with the Beatles, the Elvis cover. The recording was quickly discovered to be a fake, and this just was continuing the fraudulent way Pauline was perpetuating her brother's memory. So I've got one last thing to share with you, and that is some discussion by the Beatles of Millie Sutcliffe and an incident that came up during the recording of the Get Back sessions.
Well, what's Mrs. Sutcliffe want?
Well, they all want money.
This is the last cry for help. My bank is now to the wall. My back.
Back. I thought it was back.
It's just been many times before. But this is the last time since Charlie's sudden death in March '66. Oh, my consequent, illness, I have managed to exist,
Illness
but now it is the
alcoholic,
end of the
isn't it?
road.
She's an alcoholic, you know.
I beg of you, please come, if only for the sake of the boy you once knew.
You know, what's it got to do with me?
What's it got to do with Stu?
Yeah.
I mean, she didn't know him.
No, he hated her anyway. I remember at college he used to tell me. Except that she gave him 20 ciggies a day and 5 bob. So, I mean, it's registered, hasn't it? So I've got to just write to her and say, what? Or something, I owe her. Could we carry on here in the rock and roll show?
Yeah.
Those comments from the Beatles may sound a little bit harsh, but people were after them for money all the time. And Lennon gives some interesting comments about what Stuart had said about his own mother. So that I found interesting. Who knows, maybe Pauline caught wind of these comments years later, and she got pissed off by that. I don't know, but I thought that was kind of an interesting thing, hearing the Beatles in 1969 still being hounded for money by Millie Sutcliffe. Well, that concludes part 2 of my Stuart series, and this is one of the more blatant times where somebody really tries intentionally to change the Beatles story with lies. And the manipulation and the way that she used the press here, I mean, she did nothing but embarrass herself here. And it's great that at least we can see that these were lies, because some of this stuff gets perpetuated. And, you know, John Lennon, his name gets blackened even further, as if he needed anybody else's help. You know, he's got his own problems. But I just find it to be a diabolical way for somebody's family member to utilize others and blacken others' names just to get money, essentially. So there you have it. But I will give Pauline Sutcliffe a lot of credit for curating her brother's art. I think that was a wonderful thing she did, and it's too bad she had to go about it the way she did. So thank you for watching. I've got plenty of merchandise that you can look at on my website, popgoesthe60s.com. I've got some Beatles stuff there. And an easy way to support this channel is just hitting that subscribe button and sharing this video with somebody who you might think would appreciate it. Thanks for watching. Pop Goes the 60s.